There is a war happening right now, and most people don't even know they're standing in the middle of it. Not a war of guns and bombs, a war of the soul. Exorcists who have spent decades in deliverance ministry, men who have looked into eyes that were no longer fully human, who have heard voices that did not belong to the person screaming them, all say the same terrifying thing. The attack rarely starts with a full possession. It starts small. It starts quiet. It starts with signs so subtle that most people mistake them for bad luck, bad moods, or just a rough patch. By the time most families realize what's actually happening, months, sometimes years, have already passed. The oppression has taken root. The exhaustion has become normal. The isolation has become a habit. And the fear has become so constant that nobody even remembers what peace used to feel like. Catholic exorcists and deliverance experts have spent their entire priesthood cataloging these warning signs, not to scare you, but to arm you. Because here is the truth nobody tells you. Spiritual attack does not usually announce itself. It disguises itself as insomnia, as coincidence, as a sudden falling out with people who used to protect you, as an illness doctors cannot explain. Today, we are going through 7 signs that priests trained in deliverance ministry say you should never, ever ignore. Some of these will surprise you. Some of these might already be happening in your life or the life of someone you love right now. Stay until the end, because sign number 7 is the one almost nobody recognizes until it's already too late. Let's begin. The first sign is the one doctors dismiss the fastest, and the one exorcists take the most seriously. It's a tiredness that doesn't make sense. Not the ordinary fatigue of a long week or a bad night's sleep. This is a bone-deep, soul-deep exhaustion that arrives without explanation and refuses to leave no matter how much rest you get. People experiencing this kind of oppression often sleep 8, 9, 10 hours and wake up feeling as if they hadn't slept at all. Some describe it as a weight pressing down on their chest the moment they open their eyes, an invisible hand holding them to the mattress, whispering that there's no point getting up. In deliverance ministry, this is often one of the earliest and most consistent markers of spiritual oppression. The reasoning behind it is simple but chilling. The demonic does not need to announce itself with dramatic head spinning or guttural voices. It is far more efficient and far more effective to simply drain a person, wear them down, make them too exhausted to pray, too exhausted to go to Mass, too exhausted to resist temptation, too exhausted to even notice that something is wrong. Exorcists trained in this field often describe the enemy's strategy as one of attrition rather than assault. Why launch a visible attack when invisible erosion works just as well? A person who is constantly fatigued stops going to confession because it feels like too much effort. They stop praying because their mind is too foggy to concentrate. They stop reaching out to their support system because socializing suddenly feels unbearable. Slowly, without a single dramatic event, their spiritual defenses crumble. not because they were destroyed, but because they were never used. What makes this sign so dangerous is how easily it hides in plain sight. We live in a culture already exhausted by overwork, poor sleep, constant screen exposure, and chronic stress. So when someone says, "I'm just tired," everyone nods and moves on. Nobody stops to ask, "Tired since when? Tired starting after what?" Tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. That last question is the key one. Ordinary tiredness responds to rest. You sleep, you recover, you feel human again. Spiritually rooted exhaustion does not respond the same way. People describe waking up from a full night's sleep feeling somehow worse, heavier, foggier, more hopeless than when they went to bed. Some describe a strange reluctance to even get out of bed, an aversion that has no logical source. Others notice the exhaustion intensifies specifically around spiritual activities. They feel fine all day, but the moment they sit down to pray or open scripture, a wave of drowsiness or heaviness hits them so hard they can barely keep their eyes open, only for the fatigue to mysteriously lift the second they close the Bible or stop praying. This pattern, fatigue that spikes specifically around prayer, mass, confession, or sacramentals, is one that deliverance priests flag immediately. It is not considered normal tiredness. It is treated as a resistance mechanism, something actively working to prevent the person from accessing the very tools that would protect them. There's also an emotional dimension to this exhaustion. It's often accompanied by a creeping sense of hopelessness or despair that seems disproportionate to the person's actual circumstances. Someone with a stable job, a loving family, and no major crisis in their life suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by a heaviness they cannot explain. They feel as though a fog has settled over their mind, making even simple decisions feel monumental. Joy feels distant, muted, almost inaccessible, as if it's happening to someone else behind glass. Exorcists caution against jumping to spiritual conclusions too quickly, and this is important to state clearly. Physical exhaustion, depression, and chronic fatigue are very often purely medical or psychological in nature, and anyone experiencing them should absolutely see a doctor and, if needed, a licensed mental health professional first. Spiritual oppression is not meant to replace medical explanations. It's meant to be considered when medical and psychological avenues have been explored and something still doesn't add up. The distinguishing factor priests look for isn't the exhaustion alone, it's the exhaustion combined with other signs on this list, especially a specific aversion to sacred things. There's a particular pattern deliverance ministers describe often. A person who used to love going to Mass suddenly finds themselves inexplicably drained just thinking about going. They set an alarm for Sunday morning with good intentions, and yet find themselves unable to get out of bed, not out of laziness, but out of a genuine, almost physical resistance they can't name. They chalk it up to being not a morning person or just going through a phase, never questioning why this sudden aversion appeared out of nowhere after years of faithful practice. This is why exorcists urge people not to dismiss chronic, unexplained exhaustion, especially when it's new, especially when it intensifies around prayer and sacraments, and especially when it's paired with a growing indifference toward the things of God. It might be nothing more than a stressful season of life, but it might also be the very first quiet knock of something far darker, testing whether anyone is paying attention. And if no one is, it moves on to sign number 2. The second sign is one of the clearest markers exorcists look for, precisely because it is so specific and so hard to explain away. A sudden, irrational aversion to sacred things. This isn't ordinary religious doubt. Doubt is intellectual. It asks questions, wrestles with theology, seeks answers. What deliverance priests describe is something entirely different. A visceral, physical, almost allergic reaction to holy water, crucifixes, blessed objects, church buildings, or even the sound of certain prayers. Picture someone who has walked into the same church every Sunday for 20 years without a second thought. Then, seemingly overnight, they find themselves inexplicably uneasy the moment they cross the threshold. Their chest tightens, their skin crawls. They feel an overwhelming urge to leave, even though nothing around them has changed. They can't explain why. They just know that being there suddenly feels wrong, unbearable, almost dangerous. Exorcists describe similar reactions to holy water. A person might describe a burning or stinging sensation on their skin, or a wave of nausea, anger, or anxiety the moment holy water touches them, despite having used it comfortably their entire life. Others report a sudden, intense discomfort around crucifixes or religious images that previously meant nothing to them one way or another. Some describe an almost magnetic repulsion, an urge to look away, to leave the room, to avoid the object entirely, paired with irritability or anger that feels disproportionate and foreign, as though the emotion isn't fully their own. What makes this sign so significant in deliverance ministry is the specificity of the aversion. It isn't a general dislike of religion or a rational disagreement with doctrine. It targets sacramentals specifically. Blessed salt, blessed oil, relics, rosaries, holy images. Exorcists trained in this field often test for this precisely because demonic entities are, according to church teaching, forced to react to sacred objects in ways ordinary discomfort simply doesn't produce. A skeptic who doesn't believe in holy water will feel nothing when it touches them, because to them it's just water. But someone under spiritual attack often reacts with an intensity that startles even them, an intensity that makes no logical sense given their own stated beliefs. There's also a subtler version of this sign that's easier to miss. Growing irritation or exhaustion, specifically during prayer, at Mass, or during the reading of Scripture, but not at other times. Someone might feel calm and normal all day. Then the moment the gospel is read at Mass, they're hit with a wave of anger, boredom so intense it borders on physical discomfort, or a compulsive urge to check their phone, leave the pew, or think about literally anything else. Deliverance priests note that this spiritual restlessness and inability to sit still or focus specifically during sacred moments, despite having no such trouble in secular settings, is a pattern worth paying close attention to. Family members often notice this sign before the person experiencing it does. A mother might tell her son, "You used to love praying the rosary with me. Now you get angry the second I bring it up." A spouse might notice their partner suddenly refuses to keep a crucifix in the bedroom, insisting, without being able to say why, that it needs to be moved to another room or covered or removed from the house entirely. These aren't stylistic preferences. Exorcists describe a qualitative difference between someone simply not caring about religious decor and someone reacting with genuine hostility or fear toward a specific object that used to mean nothing negative to them at all. It's worth being careful here, because this sign is also the one most easily misapplied. Plenty of people go through genuine crises of faith, intellectual doubt, anger at God after tragedy, disillusionment with the institutional church, and none of that is, by itself, evidence of spiritual attack. Faith struggles are a normal, even healthy, part of many people's spiritual journeys, and treating every doubt as demonic does a real disservice to people who are simply wrestling honestly with belief. What deliverance priests look for is different in kind, not just degree. A physical, involuntary, almost reflexive reaction, nausea, burning, overwhelming panic, a compulsion to flee, specifically triggered by sacred objects or moments, especially when it appears suddenly, without a clear emotional or intellectual cause, and especially when the person themselves is confused and disturbed by their own reaction. When someone says, "I don't understand why, but I can't be near that rosary anymore, and it terrifies me that I can't explain it." Combination of aversion and self-aware distress is what exorcists take seriously. This sign rarely appears alone. It tends to show up alongside the exhaustion from part one, and it often escalates alongside the next sign we're going to cover, one that doesn't just affect the person's body and reactions, but starts creeping into their sleep, their dreams, and the very silence of their home. The third sign moves us into the hours when most people are at their most vulnerable, the night. Exorcists and deliverance ministers consistently report that spiritual oppression tends to intensify after dark, and one of the earliest indicators families report is a dramatic shift in sleep. Not ordinary insomnia caused by stress or screen time, but something stranger, recurring nightmares with a disturbingly similar theme, night after night, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. These aren't random anxiety dreams. Deliverance priests describe a particular pattern, dreams involving being chased, held down, or unable to scream. Dreams featuring a dark, formless presence standing at the foot of the bed or in a doorway. Dreams that repeat with eerie consistency, even though the dreamer has never experienced anything like it before. People often describe waking abruptly at the exact same time every night, commonly cited around 3 a.m. Time some priests associate symbolically with the inversion of the hour traditionally linked to Christ's death. Gasping, disoriented, with a racing heart and an overwhelming sense of dread they can't shake for hours afterward. Sleep paralysis is another phenomenon that comes up frequently in these accounts. Medically, sleep paralysis is a well-documented and explainable condition. The body remains in the muscle-immobilized state of REM sleep while the mind becomes conscious, often accompanied by hallucinations of a presence in the room. Most cases have nothing to do with spiritual attack whatsoever, and anyone experiencing it regularly should absolutely discuss it with a doctor first. But deliverance priests note that in some cases, people describe an added element beyond the typical hallucination, an unmistakable sense of malevolent intent, a feeling of being deliberately held down by something that wants to harm them, sometimes accompanied by a crushing weight on the chest, a whispering voice, or a distinct feeling of hatred directed at them personally. It's this qualitative element, malice, not just fear, that shifts it in the eyes of some deliverance ministers from a medical curiosity into something worth further spiritual investigation, beyond dreams and paralysis. Some families report disturbances in the home itself during nighttime hours, unexplained sounds, footsteps, knocking, scratching that occur specifically at night and specifically to one person, while others in the house sleep through it undisturbed. Doors that were closed found open. A persistent feeling of not being alone in a room that is, by every observable measure, empty. Pets behaving strangely, growling at empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms, staring fixedly at nothing for long stretches. It's essential to say clearly. The overwhelming majority of nighttime disturbances have completely ordinary explanations. Old houses creak. Anxiety disorders cause hypervigilance and disrupted sleep. Sleep paralysis is a known neurological phenomenon experienced by a significant percentage of the population at some point in their lives. Nightmares are often the mind's way of processing unresolved stress, trauma, or fear. Before anyone reaches for a spiritual explanation, a doctor, and ideally a sleep specialist, should be consulted because treatable, ordinary causes are, by a wide margin, the most likely explanation, and ruling them out is both responsible and necessary. What deliverance priests emphasize, though, is pattern and context. Not any single bad night, but a cluster of experiences that arrive together and escalate together. A person who begins having consistent, malevolent feeling nightmares, at the same time, they're experiencing the unexplained exhaustion from part 1 and the aversion to sacred objects from part 2 is a very different case than someone who has one bad dream after a stressful week at work. There's also a spiritual logic behind why nighttime specifically matters in this framework. Traditional Catholic teaching has long held that periods of stillness, including sleep, remove the ordinary distractions and defenses a person maintains during waking hours. Their conscious will, their active prayer life, their engagement with the world. In that stillness, according to this framework, person is considered more spiritually exposed, which is part of why many traditional Catholic practices include specific nighttime prayers, like the St. Michael prayer or a final sign of the cross before bed, as a form of spiritual protection heading into those vulnerable hours. Exorcists often ask families directly, has anyone in the house stopped praying before bed? Has a nightly routine of a blessing, a rosary, or even a simple prayer quietly fallen away? It's a small thing, easy to let slip during a busy season of life. But deliverance priests view consistent nighttime prayer as one of the most basic, most effective forms of ordinary spiritual protection, and its quiet absence is something they take seriously when disturbed sleep is already part of the picture. If nighttime has become something to dread rather than something restful, and if that dread has arrived alongside the other signs already discussed, deliverance priest would say it's time to pay very close attention, because the fourth sign takes this same pattern and moves it out of dreams and into something far more disruptive. The relationships that are supposed to protect you. The fourth sign is one family's oft and recognized only in hindsight, a sudden, seemingly irrational wave of conflict, isolation, and division within relationships that used to be stable and loving. Deliverance priests describe this pattern often. A close-knit family that begins fracturing with no clear cause. Arguments erupt over nothing. Old resentments that had been resolved years ago resurface with fresh, disproportionate intensity. A spouse who has never raised their voice suddenly explodes over something trivial. Parent and adult child who talked every week suddenly can't be in the same room without tension crackling in the air. And when everyone steps back afterward, confused and hurt, nobody can actually explain what the fight was really about. The theological reasoning behind why this matters is rooted in something exorcists describe consistently. Division is considered one of the primary tools of spiritual attack, precisely because isolated people are far easier to affect than people surrounded by a strong support network. A person who has a close family, a tight friend group, and a solid parish community has, in this framework, multiple layers of protection. People who will notice if something's wrong, people who will pray for them, people who will physically show up, break those bonds, and the person is left alone with whatever is happening to them, with no one to notice, no one to intervene, and no one to remind them of who they were before things changed. What makes this sign tricky to identify is that conflict on its own is completely normal. Every family fights. Every marriage goes through rough patches. What deliverance priests look for isn't conflict itself, but a specific texture to it. Arguments that feel disproportionate to their actual trigger. A sense, reported by multiple people involved, that something about the fight felt off or not like them, and a pattern where the conflict consistently targets whoever in the family is spiritually strongest or most protective. It's often described as almost surgical. The one family member who prays the most, who goes to daily Mass, who has been quietly holding the family together spiritually, becomes the one most frequently at the center of unexplained tension, criticism, or hostility from the very people they're closest to. There's also a specific pattern around isolation that exorcists flag directly. A person who was previously social and connected begins withdrawing, not gradually and gently, the way people naturally do sometimes, but abruptly, defensively, almost as though something is actively steering them away from anyone who might help them. They stop answering calls from their closest friends. They cancel plans repeatedly, always with an excuse that sounds reasonable on its own, but forms a troubling pattern over time. They become secretive about their schedule, irritable when asked where they've been, resistant to any suggestion that they reconnect with the people who used to be their support system. Sometimes this isolation is directed specifically at faith-based relationships. A person who used to attend a men's or women's prayer group suddenly finds every excuse not to go. A person who used to call their godparent or spiritual mentor regularly suddenly stops, and when asked why, gives vague, deflecting answers or becomes visibly irritated at the question. Priests in deliverance ministry often note severing ties specifically with people who provide spiritual accountability, a sponsor, a mentor, a devout friend. A spiritual director is one of the most consistent patterns they see, precisely because those relationships are the ones most likely to notice something is wrong and say something about it. Families experiencing this often describe a haunting sense of watching someone they love slowly slip away, not physically, but emotionally and spiritually, becoming a stranger in increments so small that no single week feels alarming, but the cumulative change over a few months is stark and frightening. Here, too, it's critical to be careful and honest. Family conflict has an enormous number of completely ordinary causes: financial stress, unresolved grief, undiagnosed mental health conditions, substance abuse, infidelity, simple personality clashes that finally boiled over after years of accumulation. Mental health professionals and family counselors should always be the first resource for relational breakdown, and most conflict, even sudden and severe conflict, has nothing whatsoever to do with spiritual attack. Attributing ordinary human conflict to demonic influence isn't just inaccurate. Deliverance priests themselves warn that it can be spiritually and psychologically harmful. Letting real treatable issues go unaddressed while everyone blames something invisible instead of doing the hard work of communication, therapy, and reconciliation. What tips the scale, according to those trained in this ministry, isn't conflict alone. It's conflict combined with the other signs already covered. Exhaustion that doesn't lift, aversion to sacred things, disturbed nights, and now division, specifically targeting the most spiritually engaged members of a household. When these begin to overlap and compound, deliverance priests say it's worth taking a closer, more structured look. starting with prayer, the sacraments, and if concern persists, a conversation with a priest. And that overlapping pattern brings us to sign number 5, one that moves from relationships between people to something happening entirely within the mind. The 5th sign is, according to many deliverance priests, one of the most distressing to experience and one of the most misunderstood, intrusive thoughts that feel genuinely foreign to the person having them. Everyone experiences intrusive thoughts from time to time, a fleeting, unwanted, even disturbing thought that pops into the mind uninvited. This is an extremely common and well-documented feature of ordinary human psychology, and on its own, it means nothing spiritually. What deliverance priests describe as potentially significant is something more specific, a pattern of intrusive thoughts that are violent, blasphemous, or self-destructive in nature, that arrive with unusual intensity, that increase specifically during prayer or at church, and that feel, in the person's own words, distinctly not mine. People describe this in strikingly similar terms across countless accounts. A devout person kneeling in prayer, sincerely trying to focus on God, suddenly bombarded with violent or obscene thoughts that horrify them, thoughts about harming someone they love, blasphemous statements against God or the Eucharist, or disturbing sexual intrusions that have no connection to anything in their actual life or character. The thoughts arrive uninvited, forcefully, and are immediately followed by intense shame, confusion, and fear, precisely because the thought feels so alien to who the person actually is and what they actually believe. This is a critical distinction that deliverance priests themselves insist on making very carefully. The mere presence of an intrusive thought is never by itself evidence of spiritual attack, and it's certainly never a sin in itself. Intrusive thoughts are a normal, if uncomfortable, feature of human cognition, and they are especially common in certain anxiety disorders, most notably a subtype of obsessive-compulsive disorder, sometimes called scrupulosity, or pure O, purely obsessional OCD, in which sufferers experience exactly this kind of unwanted, violent, sexual, or blasphemous thought, often centered specifically around religious or moral themes, precisely because the thoughts attach themselves to whatever the person values and fears losing the most. This is a well-recognized clinical condition, and it responds well to proper treatment, typically a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically exposure and response prevention, and in some cases, medication. This is why responsible priests, including those in deliverance ministry, consistently and strongly recommend that anyone experiencing distressing, intrusive thoughts see a mental health professional first before assuming anything spiritual is happening. Scrupulosity and OCD are far, far more common explanations than spiritual attack. Treating a psychological condition as a demonic one can cause real lasting harm, deepening shame, delaying proper treatment, and in some tragic cases, making the underlying anxiety significantly worse. So what, if anything, distinguishes ordinary, if painful, intrusive thoughts from something deliverance priests consider worth deeper spiritual attention. A few patterns come up repeatedly in their accounts. First, the timing. Thoughts that intensify dramatically and specifically during explicit acts of prayer or worship. The moment someone begins the rosary, the moment the priest elevates the Eucharist, the moment someone opens Scripture, and then subside just as abruptly once that specific religious act ends, rather than following the more generalized, situationally inconsistent pattern typical of OCD. Second, content that feels less like anxious, what if catastrophizing, the hallmark of OCD, where the person is terrified of the thought precisely because they don't want it to be true, and more like something being actively inserted, described by some as a sensation of a thought landing in their mind from outside, distinct in character and voice from their own normal internal monologue. Third, and this is a point deliverance priests return to again and again, a sudden, uncharacteristic onset in someone with no prior history of anxiety, OCD, or intrusive thoughts of any kind, especially when it appears alongside several of the other signs already discussed in this list. Even with these distinguishing patterns in mind, priests trained in this ministry are remarkably consistent on one point. They do not skip the medical and psychological evaluation ever. Every reputable exorcist requires a psychological and medical assessment before ever proceeding with anything beyond ordinary prayer, precisely because the overwhelming majority of these cases turn out to be psychological, and proper treatment resolves them completely. Deliverance ministry, in the Catholic Church's own official guidelines, is explicitly meant to be a last consideration, not a first one, pursued only after natural explanations have been thoroughly and honestly ruled out by qualified professionals. If you or someone you love is experiencing violent or blasphemous intrusive thoughts, the single most important first step is the same, regardless of the ultimate cause. Speak to a doctor or licensed therapist, ideally one who understands both religious scrupulosity and OCD specifically. Single step resolves the vast majority of these cases, and for the rare remainder, it's also the necessary first step any responsible priest will require before considering anything further. For those cases where the thoughts persist despite proper treatment, where they follow the specific patterns described above, where they exist alongside the other signs in this video, that combination is what moves this from a private psychological struggle into something a spiritual director or priest may need to be part of the conversation about, too. Which brings us to the sixth sign, one that moves beyond thoughts and feelings into something physical, something that leaves marks doctors can't explain. The sixth sign covers a category deliverance priests describe cautiously and reluctantly, precisely because it's the one most susceptible to exaggeration, coincidence, and misdiagnosis. Unexplained physical symptoms. These accounts typically describe things like sudden, severe illness with no clinical explanation despite thorough medical testing, strange marks, scratches, or bruises appearing on the body with no identifiable cause, a sensation of being physically touched, pushed, or restrained by an unseen presence, or a pattern of coincidental accidents and injuries that seem to cluster around specific times, places, or activities, particularly, according to these accounts, around attempts to pray, attend Mass, or otherwise re-engage with faith after a period of drifting away. It cannot be overstated how important it is to treat this category with extreme caution. The human body produces an enormous range of symptoms that medicine simply hasn't fully explained yet, and doctors can't find a cause is unfortunately an extremely common experience for people suffering from real serious, purely physical conditions, autoimmune disorders, rare neurological conditions, and dozens of other diagnoses that can take years to properly identify. The responsible, non-negotiable first step for any unexplained physical symptom is always thorough medical evaluation, ideally from multiple specialists if the first round of testing comes back inconclusive. No priest trained in legitimate deliverance ministry will tell a suffering person to skip this step, and any who does should be regarded with serious concern. What deliverance priests describe as potentially significant, and this bears repeating only after medical avenues are genuinely exhausted, is symptoms that cluster specifically around spiritual activity. Pain or physical distress that spikes noticeably during prayer, blessed water, or the presence of a crucifix, and eases just as noticeably once that specific stimulus is removed. Strength or reactions during moments of apparent distress that seem, to multiple independent witnesses, to exceed what should be physically possible for the person's size, age, or condition, or a consistent, reproducible pattern connecting physical symptoms to specific religious triggers rather than the more randomly distributed pattern typical of most illnesses. There's also, within this same broad category, something Fref Ripperger and other deliverance-trained priests discuss specifically: the concept of attachment through objects. In traditional Catholic teaching on this subject, certain items, particularly those connected to occult practices, given as gifts with harmful intent or inherited from someone deeply involved in something spiritually dangerous, are believed to sometimes serve as a point of connection for oppression to enter or persist in a home. This might include Ouija boards, certain occult books or artifacts, or items explicitly used in curses or hexes. The teaching here is not that ordinary second-hand furniture or antique jewelry poses some blanket danger. That kind of fear-driven thinking is explicitly discouraged by serious deliverance priests, who are often quick to push back against exaggerated, superstition-driven object fear that has more to do with anxiety than actual theology. Rather, the concern is specifically about items with a known deliberate connection to occult practice. All 6 of these signs, exhaustion, aversion to sacred things, disturbed sleep, relational division, foreign intrusive thoughts, and unexplained physical symptoms share something important in common. Individually, every single one of them has a far more common, far more likely, entirely natural explanation. Every reputable priest in deliverance ministry will insist on ruling those explanations out first thoroughly with real medical and psychological professionals before ever considering anything beyond that. Which brings us finally to the seventh sign, the one we promised at the beginning, and the one that almost nobody recognizes until it's already deeply entrenched. The quiet, gradual erosion of the desire to pray at all. This is different from every sign before it. It isn't dramatic. It isn't frightening in an obvious way. It's simply this. A person who once had a rich, consistent, life-giving prayer, life finds that desire slowly evaporating, not through any single decision, not through any crisis of faith they could point to, but through 1,000 small moments of "I'll pray later" that quietly become never. The rosary that used to sit by the bed gets moved to a drawer. The daily Mass that used to anchor the week becomes a Sunday obligation, then an occasional Sunday, then a distant memory. And the person looking back months later often can't identify a single moment where anything changed, only that somewhere along the way, the desire itself simply went quiet. Deliverance priests consider this the most dangerous sign of all, precisely because it's the least alarming. There's no fear attached to it, no obvious crisis prompting anyone to seek help. It simply feels like drifting, ordinary, forgivable, human drifting. And that, according to those who've spent their lives studying this pattern, is exactly what makes it so effective. A war that ends not with a dramatic battle, but with the quiet, unnoticed surrender of the one weapon, prayer, that could have won it from the very beginning. If any of these 7 signs sound familiar in your own life or in someone you love, the response deliverance priests recommend is never panic and never isolation. It's the opposite. Reconnect with the sacraments, speak honestly with a priest, and if physical or psychological symptoms are present, see a doctor and a therapist without delay or embarrassment. The teaching across this entire tradition is consistent on one point above all others. You were never meant to fight anything, seen or unseen, alone.